Good morning, boys and girls. For history today, we are going to continue hearing about the 13 colonies as we keep moving a little bit further north. We were hearing about Plymouth with the Puritans recently, and we are going to be moving to talking about Massachusetts today with the Puritans. So let's get started on that. Still in this New England territory. And continuing on with, Plymouth was in current day Massachusetts anyway. So we're going to be hearing about an extension of that region today. So if you'll recall, the last time we read it, what was unique about the colony that we just read is that they had very good ties to the Native Americans. They actually, had the Native Americans as a good resource because they taught them about proper farming techniques, and they really lived side by side in this land that they shared. So it makes sense to be on good terms with them. But others who came before them oftentimes were scared or just intimidated of the Native Americans. They didn't know what to expect, but they did a good job of integrating. And we've seen a little bit of that as well with like Powhatan before. Okay, here is Chapter 11, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritan Mission. Now, 10 years after the Pilgrims settled Plymouth, more English settlers arrived in New England. Their settlement was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These settlers were known as Puritans. Now the Puritans were not like the Pilgrims. The Puritans did not want to leave the Church of England. Instead, the Puritans wanted to purify or change the Church of England. They didn't want to leave it altogether. They were interested in just making revisions. So stay part of that Church of England, but make some changes. Now, John Winthrop was leader of the Puritans who came over. He believed that God brought the Puritans to North America for a reason. Winthrop wanted the Puritans to be an example of how Christians could live together in a community and to be unselfish people. He believed that the whole world would be watching to see if the Puritans could succeed. So he has a high expectation of all of the Puritans to live life well because he's saying everybody's watching to see us as an example. There's John Winthrop. Now, in the beginning, about 100 pilgrims started Plymouth Colony, 100 pilgrims, but almost 25,000 Puritans came to Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1630 to 1660. So way more Puritans came. Now, this enormous wave of settlement is called the Great Migration. A migration is a movement from one place to another. So in this case, moving from England to Massachusetts. That is huge. 25,000 people moved. Now, during the Great Migration, Puritans started small towns all over eastern Massachusetts. In each town, they built their houses and their meeting house or house of worship near a large grassy area called a common. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to see this. So you can see the different houses set up with that meeting house, the place of worship right there in the center. Now, everyone who lived in a Puritan town had to obey very strict rules. Once again, going back to, they said, we are an example if other people are watching, so they have some rules in place. Not sure if that was mainly from John Winthrop or from somebody else in the community or just a combination. Now, each town was governed by land-owning men who met to make rules and decisions. Only members of a town's Puritan congregation could own land or vote in the town meeting. So you had to be part of the Puritan congregation, which means going to that Puritan church to be able to own land. So it was very much this area of land specifically for people of that sector, branch of Christianity, this Puritans who were a version of the Church of England. Now, joining a congregation was not easy. You had to answer many hard questions about your life and your beliefs. So that was common of other churches at the time too, that took a lot of work to become technically a member of that church. So this one was that way as well. People who were not Puritans did not enjoy religious freedom. They could attend their own churches, but they were forced to also attend Puritan church services and pay taxes to support the Puritan ministers. So you could live there if you wanted to, and you could go to a different church, but you also had to go to a Puritan church and pay taxes to them. Now, those who opposed Puritan religious teachings were punished. Some were forced to leave town. People who were forced to leave Puritan towns sometimes started their own towns, which makes sense. Many of these towns were founded in a new colony called Rhode Island, which you'll read about in the next chapter. So a lot of them moved into Rhode Island who were not Puritans. Most likely, they were Christians, maybe even members of the Church of England, but they didn't want to have specifically the Puritan, they didn't want to be part of the Puritan community. Now, through the 1640s, new settlers kept coming to the colonies from England. The population was also growing naturally. Unlike in England, and even in the southern colonies, more and more New England children lived to become adults and parents. This was largely because there was less disease. So in many of the other colonies that we've heard about, like Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, there were all these diseases. So that, naturally it would happen that people start having kids, and then those kids grow up, and then over several decades, you've got a much larger population as you've had more and more generations have children. But at that time, all of the people here would die, or not all of the people, but a lot of them would die of diseases at a pretty young age. And so it wasn't the case that the population was growing and growing and growing. But it's different in Massachusetts with the Puritans, did not have as much disease. So here's a comparison. We've got a nice little chart here showing the population growth in several of the New England colonies specifically. So Connecticut went from 4,000 in 1650, and then 50 years later, 25,000, almost 26,000 people in Connecticut in just 50 years. That's a lot of growth. Massachusetts went from 15,000 to 55, almost 56,000 in 1700, 50 years later again. So, and then just in 10 years, a lot of these almost double, not New Hampshire quite as much. It started off smaller, and then it also did not grow nearly as much. New Hampshire didn't. But Rhode Island went from 785 to almost 6,000 in 50 years. So that is, we don't have a chart comparing that to the southern and middle colonies, but that's great growth in the New England colonies. Now, these growing families needed more land. So 2 new colonies were later founded by Puritans from Massachusetts. Those 2 colonies were Connecticut and Delaware. So those 2 became part of the Puritan colonies. Now, although New England was a healthier place to live than the South during the 1600s, because they would have malaria and different things like that in these hotter southern states, these colonies. So it was healthier in some ways, but the colonies in New England did not have good soil. The winters were really long and cold, and this meant that the growing season was short. So most New England families could grow only enough food to feed themselves. However, the region was rich in other ways. There were great forests and a long coastline with natural harbors for ships. The New England colonists built some of their towns along the coast. These towns became centers for fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. So it's not going to have those huge plantations like we heard about in the South, but they would have enough things for themselves and then trade, and they would have especially a lot of fishing and shipbuilding. Now, New Englanders became very good at fishing in the ocean off the coast. This part of the ocean had plenty of fish, especially cod. Now, cod was tasty, and many people in Europe actually liked to eat it. So it wasn't just trading within the colonies, they were trading to Europe. The colonists dried the cod so that the meat would not spoil. Then they shipped the cod to England and to the West Indies. Dried cod became to New England what cash crops were to the southern colonies. So they did really well with that dried cod. New Englanders cut timber from the forests also for shipbuilding. Tall trees were chopped down to make masts for ships. A mast is the post in a ship to hold a sail up. Now, carpenters cut and shaped the wood to make other parts of the ship. Sailmakers made the ship's sails, while blacksmiths made the ship's anchors. Men called coopers made barrels to hold cargo food and fresh water for long voyages. So here were some barrel makers. So people had different trades. They might have been carpenters, or there were some blacksmiths, and this barrel maker is kind of a combination of the two, it looks like, because they're working with wood and metal. Now, New England harbor towns were busy places. Ships were loaded with dried cod, timber, and furs. The ships sailed to England, the West Indies, or other colonies. Other ships arrived with sugar and enslaved workers. Still more ships brought tools, glassware, and mail from England. The harbor towns grew faster than, and with this about the enslaved workers, there were not as many in New England as the South because there weren't the plantations and everything. But they did have some, and then there were some that had a better opportunity for life, because if they were able to work their way into a trade like this, it's possible that they'd eventually have freedom. But it depended. Obviously, there were some of those indentured servants who worked their way to freedom. Sometimes that was the case for enslaved workers, but not often. Now, the harbor towns grew faster than the other New England towns. So yeah, they grew fast. Did I read that one? I don't think so. They grew faster than the other New England towns, those harbor ones being right along the ocean. Ships filled with people and their belongings also sailed into the harbor towns. New colonists came to live and work in New England. Fishing and shipbuilding provided jobs for many people. Others found work on the docks and in warehouses. Okay, well, that was all for that chapter. We're going to hear more about Puritan life, getting more into the rules that they have and what daily life would have been like for them in several of those colonies that were started by Puritans during that mass migration, or I forget, the Great Migration, as they came over. There was a little bit more I was going to read to you guys before we go. We might read from some Story of the World another time, but let's take a look at this. There's Rhode Island. We're going to get to that next. Okay, let's read this little section on Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Puritans. I think it's always interesting to hear if there's anything extra. These are not written by the same people, so just because something's on the same topic does not mean the information is the same at all. And it doesn't, they are both very good historical texts. However, it's just going to share different information. Now, the Pilgrims soon had company on the shores of the land they called New England. Another group of English colonists, called the Puritans, began coming in large numbers, which we already saw was 25,000. Now, the Puritans were deeply religious, they were well educated, and highly skilled. There were tailors, which means people working on clothing, cobblers, we've seen that in Farmer Boy, working on shoes, weavers and blacksmiths, lawyers, and teachers. Now, like the Pilgrims, they were unhappy with the Church of England. Now, they wanted to purify it and make it closer, bring it closer to their sense of the Bible. So they were not happy with the route that the Church of England was going. They wanted to purify it, bringing it down to what the Bible said, and not a lot of extra things. But it made some changes that we're going to hear are not great. Now, while the Pilgrims wanted the freedom to worship in their own way, the Puritans wanted to change the Church of England. Now, of course, that did not please the English kings. When King James died in 1625, his son became the new king, Charles I, which was bad news for the Puritans. He had them thrown into jail, kept from their jobs, and made life miserable for them. So they wanted to change things, just worship in a different way. The kings did not like that. And so they were thrown into jail for trying to have church in a different way. The Puritan leaders decided to make a church in the New World. So that was that gets into why they did move to America. King Charles chartered the Massachusetts Bay Company, giving them the right to establish a colony in New England. And he was happy to see the Puritans go. So both people were happy to just not be around each other anymore. By the end of the summer in 1630, about 1,000 Puritans had arrived in New England. They were led by John Winthrop, a wealthy lawyer. Now, Governor Winthrop told the Puritans that they must set an example for all the world to see. His quote was, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill," which is a verse from the New Testament. The eyes of all people are on us. So he's saying just in general that they need to live life in a way that is a good example to others. Now, in the next 10 years, the Puritans did more than build a single city upon a hill. With 20,000 more Puritans arriving in the Massachusetts Bay Colony between 1630 and 1640, they built lots of towns and cities. Now, Salem came first, then came Boston, which was well placed on a bay and bordered by a river. Boston became the capital of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it's still capital Massachusetts now. And as they kept spreading, they established Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. So we'll hear more about that later and about the Puritans and some of the ways that they lived life. Because we'll see that there's a lot of similarities in the way that they had their school and everything to what we saw with like Farmer Boy and the One Ring Schoolhouse. And maybe a little bit with what we do, like teaching Latin and Greek like we do. So we're going to get into that later. That's all for today. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And I will talk to you all later. Bye.